Hello, this is the panel. Oh, there's Sahar. Okay, right on time, so I can shut up. The boss is here.
The boss is here.
There's an old saying. I'm sure the panelists, all the participants will hear this. You never do anything contrary to an Egyptian woman. That's never do that. So
Thank you. Professor Freeman, that is such a compliment. Thank you so much. It's funny because whenever you hear the ridiculousness about saving Arab women and saving Muslim women and having to save us, and I think, maybe people need to be saved from us, not save us.
Yeah. No, I do whatever the Egyptian women say that I should do. I do it.
Okay. That's a great philosophy. As an Egyptian woman, I agree. Anyway,
you agree with me, right?
I'm glad. It looks like we have a nice, healthy list of panelists or attendees. Excuse me, of 12. I should state up front that there's a possibility that Saad Saloom will not be able to join us. He's sadly been experiencing some threats in Iraq on account of his work, and he actually for a while had to go underground electronically.
Where is he?
He's in Iraq, and he's a human rights lawyer, and I know among the things he focuses on are the rights of Iraqis of African descent, so Black Iraqis for lack of a better term. But he did tell me there is a possibility he wouldn't be able to join us. So if he's not on, so that might actually be what happened, which will just give us a little bit more time to present between the three of us. So that'll be how we'll respond to it. Okay, so before we go into the proceedings, what I thought I would do is, introduce the panel, introduce the topic, and if you don't mind, since this is kind of somewhat informal, we're online. It's a relatively small room of 15 people. So I actually prefer for each of us to introduce ourselves in terms of being able to highlight what we've done and the things that people who are online should look into if they want to look up our websites or our work, because I think that's important for each of us to do justice to, rather than just a formal introduction. So I will start first by, I'm sorry, trying to get something up while I talk to you. Sorry. I wanted to give the formal summary of the panel. So for those who are in attendance, it may not come as a surprise that the inspiration for this panel was certainly part arising from the Black Lives Matter movement, from the anti-racism movements. And nevertheless, even though the impetus behind it is somewhat of recent contemporary events, both in the US and across the globe, those of us who are speaking on this panel have been working on race for our entire careers within our respective areas of research. So in many ways, this is an opportunity for us to also showcase this work on race that we've been doing that usually hasn't gotten this much attention, because at least in the United States, there hasn't been as much, and there hasn't been an anti-racism focus as opposed to a non-racism focus. And so this is a great opportunity for us to take this conversation to abroad and focusing particularly on Muslim majority countries. So that's ultimately what the objective is, and that's why it's called Black Lives Matter, Race, Culture, and Law in Muslim Majority Countries. Okay, so I'll do a brief introduction, and then Professor Freeman and then Attorney Muhammad Azmi will each introduce each other, and then we'll go in that order in terms of presentations. So my name is Sahar Aziz. I am a law professor at Rutgers Law School in Newark. I am also a Chancellor Social Justice Scholar and a Middle East Legal Scholar there, and I'm the founding director of the Center for Security, Race, and Rights, which is the first civil and human rights center at a US law school that focuses primarily on Muslim, Arab, and South Asian diasporas in the United States through interdisciplinary lens, but also through a transnational lens. So we look at how what happens abroad affects what happens in the US. And obviously Muslim, Arab, and South Asian includes multiple racial backgrounds, but also even different religious identities within that group. And most of my research has been primarily on the post 9/11 discrimination of Muslim, Arab, and South Asians, looking at especially national security practices, laws, and policies through a critical race theory lens. And I also work quite a bit on Egypt through more of a rule of law, human rights, and anti-authoritarianism lens. So with that, I will pass on the virtual mic to Professor Bernard Freeman.
Oh, thank you very much. Now, Professor Aziz, do you want me just to introduce myself now, or to give
Yeah,
my...
just introduce yourself, and then we'll go in order of our presentations.
Okay, so I am a retired law professor from Seton Hall Law School. I still teach. I teach as an adjunct at NYU Law School, and I also run a program on slavery and human trafficking, which is based in Zanzibar, Tanzania. But that is sponsored by George Mason University, the Global Education Office. Although right now, because of the pandemic, it's unlikely that there would be any program this coming December. But normally it happens in January, December and January every year. And we take undergraduates and graduate students and teach them about slavery and human trafficking. I've written about slavery in the Muslim, both in Islamic law and in the Muslim world, from a sociological or reality point of view. And I just finished a book called Possessed by the Right Hand, which is a study of the problem of slavery in Islamic law and Muslim cultures, because it's my argument that there is still a problem with slavery and that Muslims have not really confronted either their history or the law with respect to slavery, I mean Islamic law, and that there's a need for change and reform.
Okay, and Muhammad Azmi.
Good afternoon, and thanks to having me here. My name is Mohammed Azmi Ahmed. I'm a human rights lawyer and the executive manager of a nonprofit organization working in Egypt to advocate Nubian rights in Egypt and supporting them to demanding their rights. Yeah, and just like got my master's degree from Hofstra University this May.
Congratulations. And I'm fortunate to know both Professor Freeman and Mr. Azmi. And both of you we all, I guess, have a connection to Egypt. And Mr. Azmi is being a little humble, but if you Google him, he is a fearless advocate, human rights advocate. He, and I don't know if you're going to talk about this, Muhammad, but he's been imprisoned and has really paid a very high price for his commitment to human rights, and those of us who I have so much respect for him. So thank you for your commitment. Okay, so I will spend probably no more than 10 minutes, if even that. I'm just giving an overview of the international legal regimes and the treatises that are relevant to anti-racial discrimination and protections against discrimination based on race, national origin, social origin, just so partly to save the time so that my co-panelists can just focus in on their particular focus, but also just to give people an idea of where do the Muslim majority countries, what's the official state position, and what are those international legal mechanisms that afford those protections. And then, of course, Professor Freeman, Mr. Azmi will delve into whatever domestic laws are relevant and whether or not the international legal commitments are actually enforced, which, as we all know, is not always the case, if not arguably rarely the case. So I'm going to share my screen because I just find it to be much more helpful. Okay. Okay. So most of you So I'll just quickly focus. Actually, I'm not going to do the case studies. I might do them towards the end. But I want to focus primarily on the international treaties protecting the rights of racial, ethnic, and religious minorities, and also the international legal obligations of Muslim majority countries. Okay, so many of you in the room are probably familiar, since this is an international law conference, with the various international legal instruments, but I just wanted to make sure that we put them out there. And if I missed anything, please, I hope my co-panelists add to it. But we have the most squarely on point convention, which is the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination. We also have the International Convention on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, the International Convention on the Suppression and Punishment of the Crime of Apartheid, and the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide, which would be on the basis of race, national origin, and social origin. Okay, so I wanted to kind of briefly go over at least which articles apply, and looking at the specific language. And what you'll see is the international legal regime has clearly addressed this. And I think that's a positive development in international law. But the International Convention on Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination specifically states, and these are kind of snippets taken from Article 2, Article 3, and Article 4, that first, there's a clear condemnation of racial discrimination or any policies, and encouragement for states to pursue policies to eliminate existing racial discrimination within their jurisdiction. It expects or mandates states to refrain from engaging in racial discrimination. It expects states or signatories to amend, rescind, or nullify any laws that create or perpetuate racial discrimination. The prohibition, so essentially expectation that there are in fact laws in place that prohibit racial discrimination against any person, group, or organization. Interestingly, there's also an encouragement of an integrationist, multiracial, to encourage integrationist multiracial organizations and eliminate barriers between races. So that in itself is a very interesting framing, because as you know, there's debate about that. It expects states to take special and concrete measures to protect racial groups for purposes of guaranteeing full and equal enjoyment of human rights and fundamental freedoms, condemns racial segregation, apartheid, and undertakes to prohibit and eradicate it. Goes even farther, which I think in the United States, and I'll talk a little bit about this, where you get into free speech, this is where the US is not applying these, we're not enforcing these articles. Condemn all propaganda or organizations promoting racial hatred and discrimination, prohibit dissemination of ideas based on racial superiority, hatred, or incitement to racial discrimination, and then prohibit authorities or institutions to promote or incite racial discrimination. So it's very clear that this convention is not subtle. It's very clear. And then the question then is enforcement, and obviously the devil is in the details. It also clearly states that, I'm not going to go through all of these rights, but it does clearly state that all of these rights that are listed must be enjoyed by everyone, right, within the state's jurisdiction, without discrimination of race, color, or national origin or ethnic origin. And a lot of these are just either the universal human rights or political and civil rights, but the freedom of speech, freedom to marriage, freedom to nationality, etc. So again, there really is no legal basis, at least under international law, for there to be racial discrimination. Sorry, I was reading from that and I didn't click. So these are just some of the rights that are imbued in other conventions, but also specifically stating that you cannot deny people these rights based on their race, color, or national origin. Okay, so then the next question was, well, what does this mean how does this apply to the Middle East? Well, the good news is that nearly every country, and I think it is every single Muslim majority country, has signed on to this convention. So there isn't an issue of, oh no, we're not going to sign on, we don't recognize it. The issue is going to be in the exceptions and the enforcement. Okay, so that's and this is there's no rhyme or reason for how I listed this as mainly in alphabetical order. Okay. All right, and then the covenant on technology provides many challenges. Right, so the reservations, these are the most common reservations. I didn't go through all of them, but as you can imagine, there are reservations that are made by many of these countries as well as other countries that are not Muslim majority. But the ones that are most commonly invoked are in a reservation Article 22, which is the automatic jurisdiction to the International Court of Justice in terms of enforcing the convention. There are also multiple countries, not every country, but multiple countries have some form of reservation in terms of not signifying that by signing this, because Israel is also a signatory, that by signing this, it does not signify recognition of Israel. And then there are other states that have, again, not all of them, will say, yes, we sign on, but with the reservation that it does not conflict with Islamic law. And of course, that's where things can get much more complicated, and that's beyond the scope of what I'm talking about. But that's where you can see the argument that we're not legally bound because we're going to use Islamic law as a cover. Now, granted, oftentimes Islamic law as a reservation tends to disproportionately affect women, and so the question, and I'll let my co-panelists answer this, is to what extent does that somehow justify racial discrimination? Right? This is Islamic law being used. I mean, to my knowledge, I don't think that's the case, but again, I'm not an expert on the specific country cases. Okay, and I'm gonna go I just wanted to highlight this in terms of the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, because as you all know, this focuses primarily on economic, social, and cultural rights, but it does clearly state that it includes national origin, social origin, color, and race in terms of the covenant to undertake to guarantee that the rights enunciated in the present covenant will be exercised without discrimination of any kind. Okay, so again, and for those of us in the U.S. context, we're familiar, although in the U.S. we don't have language, we don't have political or other opinion that I guess is technically covered under the First Amendment. We don't have social origin, property, birth, or other status. So we do discriminate based on that in U.S. law in multiple areas. Okay, and then with regard to the International Convention on Civil and Political Rights, these are just some of the rights that I wanted to highlight is, and again, many of these rights are not protected in U.S. law because we take issue, because of our capitalist system, we take issue to whether certain political rights and certain civil rights are human rights that are guaranteed. But it does talk about no, without distinction of any kind, such as race, color, national origin, social origin, and others. But the right to be equal, a person before the law, or the right everywhere as a person before the law, the right to freedom of thought, conscience, and religion, any advocacy of national, racial, or religious hatred that constituted incitement to discrimination, hostility, or violence shall be prohibited by law. We clearly do not have that law in the United States because we're witnessing a lot of incitement and discrimination by the state. And we saw it especially in 2016 against Muslims. And then right now, I still think it applies with the rise of right-wing extremists, and then the way that Trump is either winking and nodding at them or outright supporting them. But again, every child also shall be afforded all the rights without discrimination to race, color, or national origin. Okay, so you kind of get the point that this is progress, right? We're not having a debate as to whether race, color, national, or social origin should be a protected basis. And then again, I just thought I'd quickly show the types of reservations. This one, there are reservations here that, again, can create some big exceptions or some big gaps. Does not contravene state constitution or certain laws. Again, these are economic, social, political rights. Similarly, there are states who do not want to acknowledge Israel as a state, recognition of Israel by signing the treaty or being a signatory, and then similarly does not conflict with Islamic law. And in some cases, some states will say does not conflict with family law, right? Which tends to be informed heavily by Islamic law in some Muslim majority countries, though not all. Okay, and then quickly, just, I'm not going to go into detail on these, but just so that people in the audience know, there are also regional treaties that apply, and that the European Convention for the Protection of Human Rights and Fundamental Freedoms, which particularly applies to Turkey. That's, as you all know, Turkey is trying to get into the European Union, though it hasn't been very successful. And then there's the African Charter on Human and People's Rights, and then there's the Treaty of Lausanne, which is also binding on Turkey, particularly as how it treats its own minorities within its countries. Okay, so finally, I just want to kind of end with something that's somewhat obvious, but something we have to talk about, or at least I want to highlight, because this is a little bit more in my area of research, especially in the US, is, you know, when we talk, even the title of the talk is a little problematic because we use the word race, right? And is race even a salient identity in Muslim majority countries? It's clearly a master category here in the United States. It's what produces or contributes to hierarchy, privilege, subordination, discrimination, and people want to know whether they explicitly ask you or they're implicitly or not verbalizing, you know, what race are you? All of us are raced in the US, but in these very diverse Muslim majority countries, is the word race even salient? And is there another word that mirrors it? Or are there multiple factors, and which one would be a master category? Because obviously here it's not just race that produces the hierarchies, it's also class, it's gender, disability, sexual orientation, right? Many other identities, but race is a very strong master category, very dominant master category because of the history of the US. But in other countries, it could be tribe, it could be ethnicity, geographic origin, social origin, religion, economic class, they can put language in there. And so things get really complicated if you're trying to understand, if you're trying to take what we think of as anti-racism or racism in the US or in a Western context and juxtapose it in Muslim majority countries. And I will leave my co-panelists to address that, but I think it's just important for us to understand we are speaking, the way that we framed the panel and the way that we named it is a very American-centric framing. Right? And that's not to mean that there aren't rights that should be defended in Muslim majority countries, but it just might not be through the lens of race. Maybe that's not the right terminology. Okay, so that ends my presentation. Again, very, very broad strokes, just to give an audience a background of what international conventions we're talking about. And I will leave it to my co-panelists. You each have up to 20-25 minutes because we have some extra time. And if you'd like to share your screen, please feel free to do so. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. So Professor Freeman, take it away.
Thank you very much, Professor Aziz. It's a pleasure and an honor to be on this panel, and I trust the same will be true for everyone at the end of our talks. It's a privilege and an honor. So just to take up, I'm very glad you did those, an overview of the international conventions that will apply to this topic. And since most of my work has to do with slavery, but slavery, three of the markers of slavery overlap with the subject of this panel, which is race, ethnicity, and gender. So I think that I'm going to talk about both slavery and the law with respect to slavery, and then to the extent that it impacts on these norms against racial discrimination, I'll mention that. There is one additional international, I hope this beeping doesn't bother you. I have some advertising thing that doesn't go away on my computer. I've been trying to get it to go away. One additional convention, it's actually a protocol that's relevant to the discussion of slavery, is the Convention on Transnational Organized Crime, and a protocol to that. There's also two protocols that apply, one on migrants, on migrants, but that's not the subject of today's talk. And the other is on trafficking of persons, especially women and children, and it's called the Palermo Protocol. So those who want to find it can find it by looking up the International Convention on Organized Transnational Organized Crime, and called the protocol that's attached to that. Additional points that I think ought to be made following up on Professor Aziz's talk is that even though you have all these conventions, it appears now from the opinion of the scholars in international law that racial discrimination is a jus cogens offense, that governments and individuals don't have to have a real domestic or some sort of written law to know that racial discrimination is illegal. And so apartheid and other things like that, and various forms of racial discrimination are like torture, piracy, slavery. They're in the same category. Now, the Islamic law has not crafted a mechanism to abolish slavery. So those reservations that Professor Aziz talked about can be important in situations involving either slavery or human trafficking, because some people even argue, even today, that Islamic law, ISIS did it, they failed militarily, Boko Haram still does it, Abu Sayyaf in Philippines, they do it, and there are other insurgencies that still argue that they have the right under Islamic law to take slaves in military situations, and some people try to extend it to other forms of situations. So, and that's where the racism and slavery overlaps, because the people that tend to be victims of these efforts to either revive or to sort of do de facto slavery tend to be certain ethnicities and racial, and usually are women or children. 71% of the victims of human trafficking in the world today are women, and a good portion of the other percentage are also children. One thing from the American law that's helpful in this discussion of this, because I'm going to talk about the facts and then a little bit about Islamic law, but mostly the facts in the Muslim majority countries. One thing that's helpful is the American jurisprudential concept of badges and incidents of slavery. Even though we had the era of Jim Crow and the failure of Reconstruction, and that was a legal era as well. And the reason why those things failed is because the American states put into place laws that were designed to keep African Americans in a near state of slavery or near slavery, which most people commonly refer to as Jim Crow. And it wasn't until either the 1960s that the Supreme Court and other federal courts began to say, if it's this is actually in a statute too, if it's one of the badges and incidents of slavery, either skin color or your where you live or your origin or other kinds of things that show a slave heritage, then that's also illegal. It's also illegal for either a private party or a government to enforce those kinds of things that are related to slavery. And I think that's very relevant in terms of enforcement of the international law, and even with respect to the Islamic law, as I'll talk about. So now, that's just some background facts. Slavery and human trafficking. Slavery, and we're going to talk a little bit about how to define slavery in the Muslim majority circumstances. But slavery as it's internationally defined, which includes contemporary forms of slavery, and I'll get into those in a minute, it's the fastest growing and most profitable criminal enterprise in the world today. It had been rated as number 3 behind arms trafficking and drug trafficking, but now it's at least at number 2, at least equal to the profits and other kinds of things that benefit the perpetrators in drug trafficking. It's at least as lucrative as drug trafficking, and it's also easier to do because drug traffickers now face high transaction costs if they get arrested, life in jail, sometimes death, or long prison sentences. Not so with human trafficking. Most of the time, the trafficker or the enslaver, the person who is trafficking in slaves, is able to get away with it more often than not, especially using the vehicles that organized crime use. It's become an organized criminal enterprise. So when you look at Muslim majority countries, 15 million, there are about 40 million people said to be enslaved in the world today. 15 million of those people are in Muslim majority countries. And that is very much a larger percentage than the Muslims in the world. I haven't done the exact math on that, but it's a very high percentage, let's put it that way. And so it's the reason for that are lots. But one thing that people overlook is that there is a very direct connection between this Islamic or Muslim slave trade and what the Muslims did in terms of slave trading in the 19th, 18th, 17th century, going back, Indian Ocean especially, and across the Silk Road, and also in the Mediterranean, Ottoman slavery and other things like that. There's a direct connection between those practices and human trafficking and slavery today. So you have a class, sometimes caste, of people in Muslim majority countries who were traditionally slaves and now are still treated in that way and are also still victims of what's now called contemporary slavery and human trafficking. What do I mean by that? That's exploitation, as the international law defines it, for a number of purposes: sexual gratification, forced labor, forced or servile marriage, domestic servitude, that's house servant, debt bondage, where you work a debt that you never can pay off, child labor, forced begging, slavery by inheritance, which is called descent servitude, organ trafficking, and forced criminality, where people are forced to commit crimes for the benefit of the owner. And that's, when I say contemporary slavery, I am talking about all of those things. As I said before, the overwhelming number of people that are involved in these kinds of things as victims are female, 71%. And there are markers that you can identify as showing that a person is in one or more of these circumstances. The most commonly observed markers are inhumane workplace conditions, low or non-existent wages, a deprivation of liberty. Usually that's by taking travel papers, passport, or other identification, or sometimes it's physical restraint, inability to complain about those conditions, devaluation of their life circumstances. So the fact that they're married, the fact that they have children, the fact that they have relatives at home, the fact that they like to go to the movies, or they, like to go for ice cream sundaes on Sunday afternoon and enjoy themselves like any other human being. Those things are denied, or they are devalued by the so-called employer. So they don't help. There's massive inequality, usually based on race or ethnicity, sometimes gender. And relationships that the people have in these circumstances also have no value. Now, you would be surprised to know that the old traditional chattel slavery, where one person legally owned another person, is not dead in the Islamic world. It's still theoretically and juridically possible to purchase someone to work for you. Usually it's a young girl as a concubine, but that's possible in a number of jurisdictions. The most commonly cited one is Mauritania. 20% of the population of Mauritania remains enslaved. Those people who are, some are referred to as Haratin, but there are others, if I pronounce it correctly, but there are others that are not Haratin, which means former slave, who are also enslaved. They cannot inherit property. They cannot own land. They cannot do ordinary transactions like the rest of us. There's no dowry in marriage if they get married. And the list goes on. There are about 90,000 such persons who are in that condition now in Mauritania. There's also, it's a common problem in West Africa. There's an interesting case called Karao. Her first name was Hadijatu Karao versus Niger. When she was 12, she was sold to a notable in the village, his name was Suleiman, by her family for about $400 to work for him and be sexually available to him. She gave him 4 children. She lived with him for about 9 years as his basically concubine. There's a practice in Niger where women can be sold in these circumstances and perform a concubinal relationship. They have children and they basically work for their owner. He emancipated her, actually gave her a certificate of emancipation under this practice after so many years. And then she tried to get married. She fell in love with a man and wanted to marry him, and he prohibited that because under the Islamic law, the former owner of a slave can control things like marriage and ownership of property. So this is a badge or incident, as the American jurisprudence would describe it, of slavery. So she ignored him. She got married. He prosecuted her for bigamy and her husband for bigamy. And the Nigerian court actually agreed with him and imprisoned her. She was in prison for a month or 2, not sure how long. And eventually, though, the case was righted by a regional court because the West African states have agreed that slavery is abolished. And so the government of Niger ended up paying Mrs. Karau $21,000 in damages because they didn't keep her out of slavery, but she was enslaved for 9 years and gave her owner 4 children. And that happens a lot in these circumstances because that concubinal relationship is supported by the Muslim community and by the lower courts in many Muslim circumstances. You have, in addition to these 2 examples, Mauritania and Niger, you have a real bad situation involving forced marriage and child marriage in Egypt, where wealthy fat cats come from usually the Persian Gulf, agree with the family to marry their daughter. And this is in June when it's cooler in Egypt than it is in their home country. They sexually enjoy the woman for 3 months, and then at the end of the 3 months, they divorce her and go back to the Gulf, and she is ruined for life. No one else will marry her, and she is basically damaged goods. And so it's my argument that that's also slavery. It's a form of slavery, certainly trafficking. Now, the Egyptian government claims that it is opposed to this, but you can actually pay a fee that's put in trust for the woman if you want to have one of those marriages under the Egyptian law. They've increased the fee, but for a Persian Gulf fat cat, $6,000 or whatever the fee is now is nothing. That's like, money that you would use to buy hibiscus, cold hibiscus in the summer. So that is also a form of slavery that still exists today. And then you have the Persian Gulf, which is it's also in a sort of another category because it's more sophisticated means of exploitation that goes on there. 90% of the population of Qatar is made up of migrant workers. 95% of the population of the United Arab Emirates is of migrant workers. You have a system there which has been modified and reformed to some extent, but it's still not good. It's called kafala, which means sponsorship. Documents are taken from the worker, and the worker has no ability to change employer or to do things like I talked about before, go out and go to the movies or ice cream sundae. It's constant, very terrible work conditions with no ability to complain. There's no path to citizenship or even residency other than under this working circumstances. And the kafala system basically binds the worker to the employer in the same way that a slave was bound to his or her owner. A point that I want to make here that I haven't made anywhere else that I think is important. David Bryan Davis, the historian who's now passed away, historian of slavery who's now passed away, made this observation many years ago. Also, Robert Cover made the same observation that there's a direct relationship between slavery and homicide. That the slave, in the Islamic law, in the Islamic practice, and in the Western practice, is much more vulnerable to homicide than the non-slave. And this is why the Black Lives Matter initiative is important because it brings that out with respect to African-American men mostly encountering the police, much more likely to be killed in those circumstances. Just some examples. This is not just Africans, although Africans are really large victims of this. There are 4,000 deaths of workers in Qatar working on the World Cup. That's what's estimated is going to be by 2022. 4,000 people die on one construction project. That's like an extraordinary percentage. Nepal, the Supreme Court of Nepal has instituted now a policy that all dead Nepali coming back from the Persian Gulf must be post-mortemed because there's so much homicide of Nepali people in the Persian Gulf. For example, 1,000 Nepalese die every year in migrant working circumstances. Nepali people go out and they work because Nepal is a poor country and they look for work in other places, including the Persian Gulf. Of those 1,000, this is 2020 statistic, Nepalese who die every year in workplace accidents, 97% die in the Persian Gulf. That is an extraordinary high number of deaths. There's another figure that shows that between January and October of 2011, there were 92 unexplained deaths of Nepali people. And they say every time a 747 or airplane comes in from Kuwait or from Bahrain or from Abu Dhabi, in addition to the Nepalese getting off the plane, there are coffins coming off. So this is a high rate of homicide, unexplained homicide, people jumping off buildings, mysterious deaths in swimming pools and other places. And what's happening is that the owners, the workers of the owners of these workers are basically, when they're upset with them, killing them. Actually just doing homicide because there's no possibility that they will be prosecuted or otherwise brought to account for homicide. So they kill the worker and get another worker. And there have been a couple of cases now that have hit the news. Recently, there was a woman found in Kuwait, stuffed into a freezer, had been killed by her employers. And recently, another Ethiopian woman was dangled outside a 7th floor window to punish her for some workplace misbehavior, and the owner dropped her and she fell 7th story. She survived, but that kind of torture of the worker in that circumstance is really quite well known. So you have in the Persian Gulf what I think could be said to be basically a slave society, not in the way of the American South, not necessarily enforced by law, but enforced by the custom and in the practice and the absence of norms from Islamic law, which is what the governments in the Persian Gulf claim to be obeying. No norms in the Islamic law. There are actually norms in the Islamic law, but they're not enforced to stop these practices. So you have a very widespread death by impunity, largely with respect to people from the Indian subcontinent. But I suspect, I can't prove it, but I suspect that among Africans, people who come from Ethiopia, Sudan, Kenya, Tanzania, they are, those deaths are just as high, or there is just as much unreported and unexplained homicide among Africans working in the Persian Gulf. It's just not reported. Whereas the Nepali government now has taken an interest in it. And I really applaud the Supreme Court of Nepal in making that order. There ought to be diplomatic efforts made also. Actually, the Philippines did recall their ambassador to, I think it's Kuwait, as a result of that death of the woman found in the freezer. But now the ambassador is back and there is, I have 3 minutes, okay, and they have reinstituted the relationships. So all of these circumstances that I've described show that slavery is alive and well in Muslim majority countries. And I could go on. It's just, I've done basically 4: Mauritania, Niger, Egypt, and the Persian Gulf, which is a series, set of countries. So my message to the participants today is that the only way this is going to change is if the Islamic law takes those who announce the Islamic law and say what it is, the jurists take a position on this problem. And so I would urge diplomats and the lawyers that are advising those governments, and it includes the government of Israel, by the way. I would include them in this condemnation. Israel also tolerates human trafficking in a high degree. And so now that you have the diplomatic relationship between UAE and Bahrain, and today, I think it's Sudan, as of today, we ought to pay attention to what Israel is doing in relationship to trafficking. There are a lot of Sudanese who escape and run to Israel and are end up in these same degraded positions. And so, and that's my project to argue for. It's beyond the scope of today's talk, but to argue for change in the Islamic law and attention of the Islamic law to contemporary slavery.
Thank you so much, Professor Freeman. And I want to put a plug in for your book, Possessed by the Right Hand, the Problem of Slavery in Islamic Law and Muslim Cultures. We had the privilege of hosting Professor Freeman at Rutgers Law School, hosted by the Center for Security, Race, and Rights. And so we have his presentation, which adds additional rich details to what he talked about today. So I will just advise you all, if you want to hear more about his book and his book talk, it's at csrr.rutgers.edu, and just press on the YouTube logo at the top right hand side, and you'll see all of our talks, and you'll see Professor Freeman's very informative lecture about his book. So thank you very much, Professor Freeman, for your comments, and I'm sure we're going to have a very robust discussion about this topic, because as you remember, when you came to speak, it was a hot topic. And now I will pass it on to Mr. Mohammed Azmi, who is an Egyptian attorney and also has an LLM from the United States, and also is a human rights lawyer, to talk about the situation in Egypt and perhaps even Sudan, but particularly with a focus on Nubians.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you. And yeah, it was really good information from your presentation and the Professor Freeman presentations. That was very great to know all about the Arab country and Muslim countries and how's the situation over there. And I will try to focus more about the picture in Egypt. And we have had a good experience in Egypt about the racism and how's the situation over there. And we got some achievement that we were the first human rights organization that published many reports about the racism issue against the Black community and specifically Nubian community. I will give a fast brief about the Nubian people in Egypt. Nubian people are an ethnic group. They live alongside the River Nile in the area between Egypt and Sudan since the history. We didn't find any specific age for Nubian nation. And after they draw the border between Egypt and Sudan, Nubians has been between Sudanese people and Egyptian people. And we can consider Nubian people in Egypt, they are the only Black community in the country. So, and because we are the Nubian people, the only, I think some human rights activists don't agree with me about that, and they just say we all exactly about racism issue, because they just say like we all have several kind of discrimination here in our community. And yes, I confess that there is a discrimination in Egypt based on religion and gender and even sexual orientation, but that doesn't mean that there is no racism in Egypt. As a matter of fact, the racism is a global issue, and it's not just happening here in the States, but it happens in everywhere, and even in Muslim countries. Some people like doesn't consider it, but we still like saying there is a racism in Egypt. Some government just like deny it all the time and just saying no, we don't have. As Professor Aziz said, all the Muslim government like ratified the convention of eliminate all forms of the racial discrimination, but still they don't enforce the law. They don't enforce any of this article specifically in their community. Barrier, I moved to here to the United States. When I used to live in Egypt, I was occupying the executive manager of a nonprofit organization. We work to advocate and support Nubian community in Egypt as an indigenous people community. And one of our goals, it was to eliminate the racism in Egypt, which the government and many people say it doesn't exist. So we just trying to find the fact, only the fact. Many of Nubian people in Egypt allegedly claim that they face racism in the streets and in the schools. And about the schools, I have an example that happened like 2018 in one of the primary school with a little girl she called Basmala. Basmala, his teacher, repeatedly, just like when he called her for answering question or whatever, he just like say, "Hey, black girl, can you answer this question? Hey, black girl, can you give me this this example? Hey, black," and he just like called her by black girl. And when when her parents complain about that, they were kind of denial from the all parts from the country, like the government, uh, the attorney association in Egypt, and all the people. They just like saying there's no racism. He was just like joking with her, and he wasn't like mean to offend her or like give her an abuse or something. And that was very bad. So we decided to start a project that called the Egyptian Observatory to eliminate the racism. And we have, we started this project by 20 persons who were highly trained how to document it, how to monitoring all the forms of the racism in the media, because we were believed that the media is the first element that like spreads the racism in the community in Egypt. And I have expected some stuff before we got the results, that we gonna have like 20% of this kind of forums in the media and newspaper, but the results like exceeded my expectation. And it was 40% racist contact, like in all the movies and TV shows and newspaper and all the Egyptian media. And it was contained many forms of racism. The first one, it was the black faces. Every Ramadan, there is a show or there is a TV show or TV series or whatever, have someone painting his face by blackface. And he's just like making joke, making fun. And whenever like we start like doing kind of campaigns against that, they just like saying, hey, we're just like a comedy movie or comedy show. We don't do that like in intention to offense you or whatever. Not just that, we have else monitoring and documenting many kind of stereotype. A stereotype that black people only server. They have a server rule in all the movies. Like this is how the white Egyptian looked to black Egyptian. That they just like can be a server. They can just be a chef for their kitchen. They just can be their, you know, so not the Egyptian, not the Egyptian and not the Egyptian. They just like an enemy. Oh, this is some another form about the newspaper. Every month or every time, like we have kind of article talking about how the Nubians people in Egypt, they were an enemy for the Egyptian before they being at the same nation, and how they were fighting the Egyptian army and how they doing these all this kind of, and this is actually like makes people having this feeling that this hate feeling against the Nubian. And whenever like you talk with someone and he doesn't know about the history, he just like get all his information from the TV or from the newspaper. He just say, hey, you were an enemy. You're not from this country. And regardless of all of that, and nothing in the Egyptian penal code like criminalize anything of about that. They just like, hey, you can say it's bullying. There is no discrimination here in our community, even though the Egyptian government since 1967 they ratified the Convention of the Racial Discrimination, and in our constitution, there is some article eliminate the discrimination because of the color and the race, but still nothing still like enforced it until now. Like since 4 years or 5 years, the new constitution has this articles, but we still like having the same treatment from even the government or even the what you can face as a streets or as the workplaces or whatever. We after we published our reports about that, we got a lot of comments about the report, and we proposed a bill for the parliament, for the Egyptian parliament, and but it's still nothing happened after that. Even after we reveal this problem and we lay it down like for the discussion and to talk about it, but we still fighting this problem, and we this is our first step for that, and I think maybe after like years or something we can get some rights about that.
Thank you very much, Jasmine. I put some links in the chat for those who want to follow up on Professor Freeman and Mr. Azmi's work, and you can also Google their work and their names, and you'll find more. So we do have time for a few questions, so feel free to put it. You can either put it in the Q&A or you can put it in the chat. I have questions of my own, but I want to start with the audience first. And we have one for Professor Freeman. This is slavery in the kafala system is an international human rights issue, but as an Arab and Muslim myself, I think this is a deep-rooted cultural issue as well. In the view of the panelists, can there be an effective change if there is international pressure or change in Islamic law, as mentioned by Professor Freeman, without any mechanisms to change the mindsets of the community? How do you tackle these centuries of racism and racist thoughts in the communities mentioned? And so that one actually is also for Mr. Azmi, for both of you. So Professor Freeman, do you want to start?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I think it is a threefold effort. One, as you mentioned, the two that you mentioned, are international law, although it doesn't seem to have worked. Even the labor unions, the International Trade Union Confederation and the International Labor Organization have also been very vigorous in trying to change workplace practices and the kafala system in the Persian Gulf, and they have not been as successful. There have been some reforms, but it's still, someone said, only scratches the surface. Now, the change in the Islamic law is more difficult, but it can be done, I would argue, through the vehicle of what's called ijma, which is consensus. You would have to have agreement by all the scholars, because the text, by its literal terms, permits slavery. Now, the way that the juristic history has evolved, there are no more conditions which would lead to slavery, other than a jihad, which is rare, unlikely to happen from majority Muslim countries. So being born into slavery, or being a war captive, or from war, captive in war, it's just impossible for that to happen. So slavery ought to have died out, but it did not. So it seems to me Islamic law can take an interest in that, and the jurists, if they come together, can argue that these contemporary forms of slavery that we see, including the kafala system, are illegal under Islamic law. That's number two. But to address your point with respect to cultural change, it involves education. There is no education on the slave trade and the history of slavery in the Muslim world in public high schools or private schools, anywhere, as far as I know, in the Muslim world, other than, as Muhammad points out, these stereotypes and tropes of the Black person in a servile position, and jokes and blackface kinds of. This is what we saw in the U.S. in the 20th century. There's the Black person being viewed as some sort of person to make fun of or to be abused. And that goes also, I think, for South Asians as well, in relationship to the Arab world. So, although less overt, it's less direct. So I would recommend the making of videos, teaching modules, curriculums, and things that the governments ought to make mandatory in the 8th grade, from the standard 8, as they say there, the 8th grade, whatever the equivalent is of the 8th grade in the US, age 14 up, even before if you can. And then also a lot of TV media. The media now is all over the phones, and Al Jazeera has done its part. I can't say that they haven't done some good work, but needs to be more from the mainstream media to educate people on the history. It's very hard to change their attitude toward history. They think they did a favor to Africans by bringing them over in boats. 30% death rate just coming to the Arab world. There's a 30% death rate coming across the desert or coming across the Indian Ocean. And so the Africans that made it there, like the Africans here in the US, were only the hardiest, those who survived. And And so people have to know. Even Africans will deny that history. There are many Africans that say they're Arab because they speak Arabic. Maybe they are Arab. They speak Arabic and identify with Arabic history. That's true. But they should not deny the African contribution to Arab history.
Thank you. Hamad?
Can you repeat the question? I didn't hear you.
The question is, how can we change culture? How, I mean, you talked a lot about culture, but even if we were to change the law, and as you said, Egypt is a signatory to the Convention Against Racism or Against Racial Discrimination, how can we change culture?
I think we can start with the media, and because like media right now, it can be the first source of knowledge for many people. And whenever we start to broadcast some stuff about that and teaching people about how to respect like people of color, how to respect the differences between us, I think that gonna be like, yeah, it's for the first step in Arab countries. Yeah, I think that gonna be good at first, and after I think the policies of the education institutions, and I think the policies of education institutions is not that important than the media, because media is having this large like source of all, like many of the people in our region. Yeah, so I think that's a way we can like start with, you know.
Can I add to that a little bit? I have some skepticism about the media, though, because most people that depend on the media for their knowledge, and I'm talking about the popular media, like Instagram, Twitter, these LinkedIn, these other
official media.
Social media, that's what I'm talking
official media as
Which
well.
one? Official media?
Yeah.
Oh, you mean government media? Okay.
Yeah.
I take it back then.
Okay.
Because I think that those, I changed my mind, because those forms of media, which is where most people get their knowledge nowadays, from Google.
Yeah.
They get their knowledge from Google, and it's always a quick, superficial, very soundbitey communication of knowledge. So, but I agree with you in terms of government media and mainstream media like Al Jazeera, Arabiya, the Egyptian Nile Sat. Yeah, Nile Sat. Those media outlets can do more in-depth.
Yeah, can contribute in that. Yeah.
In-depth contribution of knowledge. Because one of the best teachers I had ever in my education was an 8th grade history teacher who made us read the Peloponnesian Wars, which is written by Thucydides. And the reason he made us read it is because it's a first-hand account.
Tunisian?
Peloponnesian War.
Okay.
And I never forgot that. And so we have to have kids in school reading first-hand accounts of slavery. First-hand accounts, if we can get them.
Okay, so this was great. I thought we were until 3:30, but it turns out we're until 3:15. That was my mistake by 15 minutes. But I did want to acknowledge a comment that we don't have time to answer, but I just want to bring it up. While I do not disagree with anything that has been said, I feel like this conversation fortifies the idea that Muslim culture is incompatible with Western ideals and human rights. In reality, slavery occurs within many other cultures and by other countries. Specifically, labor exploitation occurs in nations such as Mexico and China. If these nations don't follow Islamic law, how can we be sure a change in Islamic law will result in a real change in the treatment of individuals? And so I certainly want to acknowledge that by focusing on Muslim majority countries and only a select number. I mean, we can't do justice of more than almost 30 countries in an hour, but we're bringing this up because that's our area of expertise. Of course, we do not in any way take a position that therefore those are the only country, that there's some kind of, this is not an Orientalist panel. if you know any of us that are talking, we're usually on the other side, showing how the West is constantly portraying Muslims or Muslim majority countries or Islam as inferior or uncivilized or barbaric in some way. And that's not what we're doing here. What we're doing here is just essentially what I think the West is doing and should be doing more of, is just facing the fact that first, that color in particular, and then it transposes onto ethnicity, which I think is the most salient descriptor, does play a role in the various hierarchies, the way that power is distributed, the way resources are distributed, the way that people experience legal rights or don't experience them, but that race, that color, ethnicity, skin color, ethnicity, social origin do play a role, and that human trafficking is a serious problem, in Muslim majority countries, just as it is a worldwide problem. I mean, Professor Freeman's comment about 75% of human traffickers being women, that's across the world, I assume. It's data about the world. So it is a global epidemic. And the challenge for us is, how do we first acknowledge the problem and then come up with ways to redress it? And I would be remiss not to just bring up another white elephant in the room, is that sadly and unfortunately, the vast majority, I mean, we could probably say every country except maybe Tunisia and Turkey, are authoritarian in some way. I mean, and that's not to say that Turkey and Tunisia don't have authoritarian streaks, but there are very few countries in the Muslim majority region right now. And if we really want to be radical, we would say by Western design, or at least by Western support, that are democratic in ways that would even allow people to take on anti-racism agendas without having to face their own persecution. Right? So that just adds to the complexity. Is it's hard enough just trying to fight for human rights for the majority, and then imagine if you're trying to fight for human rights for the minority, you're much more vulnerable to that type of repression, and you don't have the usual power structures or connections to protect you from these authoritarian state practices. So it's it is a very difficult region to do human rights work, as Muhammad Azmi's experience has been. So with that, I will close. I want to thank everyone again for attending. I want to thank Professor Freeman. I want to thank Mr. Azmi, Muhammad Azmi, and I'll just put a final pitch. Please do check out the website of the Rutgers Center for Security, Race, and Rights, csrr.rutgers.edu, and stay tuned for more work that we'll be doing for the Committee on Islamic Law and Society. And if you're interested in getting engaged in that committee, please contact me at sahar.aziz@law.rutgers.edu, because we are certainly hoping to expand our programming under that committee. And with that, thank you very much to our speakers. Thank you to our attendees. Have a wonderful weekend.
Bye.
Thank you.
Assalamu alaikum.
Assalamu alaikum.